Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet, Ad Astra,
the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack, your resident space policy advocate.
And I'm Newton, I'm your guy for space technology.
Well, Newton, as we promised in last week's episode of Ad Astra, we have a awesome guest on today. Chris Hearsey is a candidate for Congress in Maryland's Fightin 6th District. Chris is an aerospace executive, research scientist, space law and policy scholar, and a Democrat running to replace John Delaney, who is currently running for president. Chris is a science enthusiast, avid chess player, and he played college hockey for American University, my alma mater. He has lived in Montgomery County for over 10 years with his wife, Suzanne. Chris and Suzanne were married at the Baltimore, Maryland Science Center in 2012. We are 30... As of recording this, 37 days from primary day. So welcome, Chris. Thank you for taking the time.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure. And thanks for that great bio and intro. So I'm really excited to be on today and talk to you guys about space and technology as well as the race. As you mentioned, I went to American University. I did my grad program there. That's how I got started in space, actually. I was towards the end of my senior year in college. I went to Temple University, and I was studying mathematical economics and physics. I was working at the time at the University of Pennsylvania Law School in the law library, and my boss at the time was like, I think you should go down to DC. And I'd only been to DC once at that time. And I got into AU. And luckily for me, I found Professor Howard McCurdy, who is a space policy expert, especially with regard to public administration of space activities. And he really got me in the field and introduced me first to space history. And that's kind of how I got into space. I started out studying, policy aspects and looking at a broader range of things, legal, and then eventually I ended up getting a graduate fellowship at the Air and Space Museum. And so I did that for a year, and my project when I was there was looking at the different ways that the National Space Act that created NASA in 1958 could have occurred. In particular, what scientists wanted to how those scientists wanted to organize for space activities. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that research because I think it's kind of cool and kind of relates back to what we're talking about today. But eventually went on and got a second master's degree, a law degree from the University of Mississippi with a concentration in remote sensing, air, and space law. And in all that time when I was going to school, you can probably call myself a professional intern, more or less. But in that time, I worked at the Air and Space Museum, as I said. I worked at the State Department. And I was lucky enough to get a position in the Office of Space Advanced Technology, where I worked on President Obama's national space policy and was part of the U.S. delegation to the legal subcommittee of the UN Peaceful Uses of Outer Space Committee.
Very cool.
So I've had a lot of different experiences when it comes to space policy and law and how we effectuate that and the intersection with technology. And I think as I've gotten older, I see how space has become, backbone infrastructure for America and our global economy. And this is something that I'm very interested in as we basically create godlike powers with the level of technology we're creating. It's quite amazing, and it has ethical issues, but also opportunities. And I want to be able to balance that in Congress.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it's great to have to hear from someone who's actually running, who is truly interested, and actually served as a part of science. Being a research scientist, and actually having a science degree. Often the complaint is that Congress is full of lawyers and some doctors, but it's nice to have someone who's truly interested in space, truly interested in the state of science, actually running for Congress. Thank you very much for that.
Well, it's amazing to me when I was growing up in the 1980s, I just envisioned a lot of this technology that exists today. I just thought about it, thought it was, either going to be here or never going to be here. Everything from, the holographic displays from Star Wars to talking about greater exploration, vis-a-vis Star Trek. And these were major influences of my life growing up, especially since I wasn't, unlike many others in the industry, not too big into science fiction. I was really kind of like looking at the pragmatic, practical aspects of space exploration. And it's funny that I really wanted to be an astrophysicist. Stephen Hawking was a big influence in my early life.
Absolutely.
And popularizing science and whatnot. But I was lucky to grow up near NASA JPL, really within the shadow of Caltech. And I used to go to their open houses at JPL. I used to go to all the lectures when I was younger. My mother would take me to go see like Kip Thorne speak. And it's amazing because, with the discovery of gravitational waves recently, I remember when he was talking about that in 1997 and talking about the state of technology. And look at like 20 or so years later, we now can minutely detect small compression and contraction of space-time. I mean, that just blows my mind.
Yeah.
But, it's something that I don't think the average person, really understands why that's important. Because if we didn't understand that, we wouldn't have GPS satellites. And it's amazing to me to hear that using GPS, U.S. assets, really, of GPS satellites to conduct science now. Now we're trying to figure out whether or not we can detect dark matter around our planet, and within the solar system. So much has happened in just a short period of time. And I'm just excited to be a part of it and being able to give voice to some concerns, but also to the benefits and opportunities that type of technology gives. And so I'm really excited to be able to run for office and hopefully someday be on the House Science Committee and talk about these in a robust way, in ways that I think that aren't giving due today in the current Congress.
Yeah, not just as individual events or individual discoveries, but how it fits into a larger scheme.
Yeah.
And I know we have that common connection with Dr. McCurdy at American. He was a mentor. He's a mentor of mine, and I took a independent summer or independent study and a summer internship with him, which is where me and Chris had met. But how it was. You factor in the culture aspect of it, not just what was going on in science and technology or the military or geopolitics. It's kind of a confluence of all these different factors. And I think having someone in Congress that understands that intersection, it might be lacking a little bit, because as we talked in our last episode, we talked a lot about how everyone's into space for multiple reasons and from different perspectives, and there's not much overlap.
Yeah.
But we're all into space. So like Ted Cruz is a great example where he's in it for the economic benefit, but someone might be into it for the human exploration benefit.
Yeah, but he's also, not that I want to say anything about Mr. Cruz, but
we're not going to pigeonhole you into,
but he is a big nerd, and he's confessed that to me before. And, he likes to tell the story about how his mother's a computer that worked on the Apollo program. But you find it everywhere. I mean, everyone is touched by space technology today, and more so than in the past. But understanding that intersection, as you say, I think is really important, because you always have to bring it back to the American people and say, well, what's the benefit? What's the point of all this? And, these are discussions that are as old as NASA. And I don't want to do NASA's promotional job for it, but I can definitely say, NASA's done a fantastic job with it through its field centers, through its education office, and promoting science and technology to a broader base. And now we're in a state which, to me, again, blows my mind, that there's a high school student here in Maryland, I'm forgetting her name, but she won a competition where her high school experiment was conducted on the International Space Station. Now, if we're at a point where elementary and high school students can be included in the space economy, I think that's great for everybody.
Absolutely. No, it's absolutely fantastic. And I was just gonna state that, it, as speaking as a scientist, it's great to hear a person who's running for Congress speak in the way that you do, so passionately about scientists. But about science, but getting to the point about the high school student being able to even run an experiment on the International Space Station. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about getting access to those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Now, for our listeners who don't know, the 6th District of Maryland is located in a fairly rural area. It basically consists of the most northwest corner of Maryland, bordering West Virginia. And according to an article that I was reading from earlier this year in Politico, and they pulled this data from the FCC, an estimated 24 million people, about 8% of Americans, still have no home access to high-speed internet service. Now, for our listeners, the FCC defines high-speed internet service as a download speed of 25 megabits per second. While a significant portion of this 24 million people are in rural tribe lands, overall, even looking at the FCC's broadband map, you can see that rural districts such as Maryland 6 are still sorely lacking in the high-speed internet. So, Chris, just sort of bouncing off of that, what do you believe are the repercussions of that kind of lack of internet access for your district, and how are you planning on addressing it?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, if you don't have access to the internet, you can't participate fully in the American economy. And that's just a fact. The second thing is that there are a lot of things that we aren't doing and haven't been doing within our education system to prepare young people for these changes. Whether it's coding classes or hardware repair. I mean, these things should be replacing wood shop and metal shop in schools. But unfortunately, those classes, along with civics, are getting cut all the time.
Yeah.
So for people who live in those rural areas, I mean, they're essentially not being able to have access to the rest of the world and the rest of the American economy. And but I'm very hopeful, because there are many companies right now that within about a 5-year time horizon that are rushing to get satellites up to create global broadband. And I think that will create a lot of good competition. I mean, I don't understand why it costs like over $80 to get high-speed internet up in those rural areas. And you think about this. I mean, these two statistics. One, only in Washington, Garrett, and Allegheny County, which is in the northern part of the district, only about 30 to 35% even have access to broadband. So this is a last mile problem. And then the second part, getting that infrastructure in place. And if you don't have even access to classes, training classes, retraining classes, you can't even get involved in the internet economy. You don't know how to build a website. You don't know how to code. You don't know how to use applications. I mean, these are things that are changing so rapidly, and the economies are being built around it so quickly. I mean, I just saw yesterday Volvo, their new Volvo car. I can't remember which model it is. Has an app. I think it's one of the first cars to have an app. And I had a constituent tell me in Frederick, it took me for the longest time to figure out what the hell was wrong with my phone, because it kept trying to sync with my car. And I said, yeah, well, this is the issue. This is the Internet of Things. Everything is being interconnected via the Internet. And we need, we have tremendous bandwidth problems. We have cost problems. But there are two things that I think that we have to look forward to. One is, and this is something that I've been championing on the campaign trail, is get to that last mile. And for a lot of those areas, either the telecoms don't want to go in there because they don't want to spend the money, or the government doesn't want to spend the money. What happens usually is sometimes, you get these consultants that will go up to these counties and tell these county officials, well, this is what you need. But after, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, they still don't have the infrastructure because it's all been wasted on studies. So, it's one thing to appropriate the money. It's another thing to understand how you set things up. And from my understanding, a lot of these companies, they want to be able to beam down from low Earth orbit high-speed internet with low latency, low delays in processing that data to mobile users. And, if you're that woman who lives in a rural area and she's trying to figure out why her phone keeps syncing with their car, like, this is the way the world is going. I don't know if you guys talked about this at all, but in about 2 years, Toyota is going to be flooding the U.S. and global markets with cars that have Kymeta antennae, and that's a really revolutionary new system, which allow GPS and all kinds of other types of signals to be processed through your phone. So essentially, essentially not your phone, but through your phone to your car. And turning your car not into a car, but really into like a living room, like an office setting. And you see that with some of these autonomous vehicle companies that are really looking at the inside out. And for us all to work together to have that level of functionality, you need more competition, you need more services, you need more players. And I think within the next 5 years, you're going to have a lot of companies like OneWeb and SpaceX and O3B and others putting up all kinds of new innovative technologies, new satellites, so that we can really integrate not only the American economy, but the entire global economy. And I think that's absolutely fascinating because that reduces all kinds of efficiencies that we've never seen in human history.
Right. I was actually reading about Kymeta very recently. It was actually last week as I was on an airplane to Tennessee. And yeah, it's a very fascinating technology, and it's going to change. It's going to change the use cases, a significant number of use cases for how we actually communicate with satellites. Just to piggyback on that a little bit more for our listeners, basically Kymeta, it's created to address the need for lightweight, slim, and efficient communication systems that don't require these big, clunky mechanical components to steer you toward a satellite. And basically, they're applying they're applying software applications to this that are easy for consumers to buy and understand. It gives you this capability to transmit and receive via a single aperture, and has sort of high-tech electronically controlled pointing and polarization. So it's a very fascinating new technology that's coming about.
Yeah, But you can see, like, just that alone can incentivize so many other markets. And I know that we didn't get to this in the intro because I guess I skipped over because I was too excited to get right into it. But, for the last, prior to running, I worked for Bigelow Aerospace.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about Bigelow, and specifically, how did someone with your background become Director of Legislative Affairs? What was your pathway to getting there? How was your time there? Why did you end up moving on?
And how did you dive into public service right after that?
Yeah, that was a lot of questions. All right, well, let's see if I can get through.
It's an hour show.
But yeah, well, first off, I was coming out of law school and couldn't really find anything. And my roommate for about 2 years, Ryan, he ended up going to be general counsel of Spaceport America out in New Mexico. And he had just started the job. I remember calling, and he calls me like 2 months later. And at this point, I decided, I'm going to take an extra semester. I'm going to do some distance classes and then, see what opportunities are here back in D.C. after moving from Mississippi. And I think my wife and I were in Miami, and he calls me late at night and he goes, you gotta call Mike Gold. Like, he's looking for someone and I can't take the job because I took another job. And I said, oh, great. So I was like, oh, that's a great opportunity. And I've always been, very interested in habitats and the law and policy that surrounds that. I did a little contract consulting work for Boeing in law school on looking at some of the legal mechanisms for a follow-on to the station. And I was like, this is perfect. This is like the perfect job for me. And somehow in my interview with Mike, I discovered that we both had a love for Montana. I had gone to the University of North Dakota. I did my second master's in space studies. So he grew up in both those states. Then it turned out that we were both got married in a planetarium. He got married at Franklin Institute in Philly, and I got married in the planetarium in the Baltimore Science Center. It was just like, so we really hit it off. And but it also helped that, like, my previous experience working at the State Department and other places, gave me a sense of how the world works, how things really work. And all of a sudden, I get offered this job before I technically had even graduated from law school. And I worked as corporate counsel for about 2.5 years and did everything. And that was probably a great experience. Mike Gold's probably the best boss you could have to learn from. And dealing with Mr. Bigelow and the company was fantastic. Seeing something built from the ground up, seeing how a space entrepreneur operates, gave me a lot of insight into so many things that I never had truly experienced on the in prior employment, so to speak. And what had happened is, I'm just trying to remember the story here. Yeah, so we went in April 2016. The beam, the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module, was placed in the trunk of the SpaceX Dragon and launched the space station. And I had been a part of that program, dealing with the contractual side, export control side, all the different sides of that. And so I got to go down to Kennedy, and that was my first launch. It was the first time I'd ever seen a launch from Cape Canaveral and from KSC, and it was pretty exciting. It was nice to finally see something that's ready to go and going to be tested out and be on the cutting edge of this new technology. And then I ended up with pneumonia on the way back. Like I had gotten sick.
Oh no!
Yeah, it was really bad. And so I ended up calling out of work for like 2 days, and then all of a sudden I'm in bed like dying. I can barely breathe. Like I can't breathe right now with all this pollen. But Mr. Bigelow called me and asked me to take over for Mike, and I considered it a great honor, and I accepted it immediately. And I went right to work. I actually got out of bed, I got dressed, hacking and everything, and went down and started the transition process. And to be part of something like that is very special. And I'm sure anyone that was at the beginning of SpaceX or Blue or other these companies can attest. It's the world looks bright and new, and you can do anything, right? The world's your oyster, and you're about to do something revolutionary. But with space, things move at a glacial pace, and even policy and law moves at a glacial pace. But for some reason, I seem to have always been at these like acceleration points. When I was at the State Department on the Obama space policy, that was accelerated. That was really a change for a president to do. And in this case, when I took over for the DC office from Mike Gold, I got thrust right into this major discussion about how are we going to essentially reorganize and re-regulate space activities. And this debate is still going on, and it's a hard thing to parse out from anyone who's just not really paying attention or doesn't really get it, because we're talking about very nuanced things like reusable launch vehicle regulations and who's going to be the person who gives the go-ahead for a payload or a rocket to get launched. But the debate really is between whether or not keeping in the Department of Transportation or the Department of Commerce, and that seems to be the tension. But that was, it was really fun to see and be part of, different studies with respect to developing a LEO economy. And that's something that I'm very, very interested in and have been interested in. So my economic background, my economic side of my brain is wants to see this flourish, because, we can't really get off the planet unless we start establishing these oases of economy bubbles, so to speak, whether it's in low Earth orbit and then finally maybe on the moon and on Mars and across the solar system. But to do that is a tremendous task. And, finding the customer base, incentivizing the customer base is a hard thing for companies, especially given that, much of the government expenditure for space is on the government side rather than like the private or the commercial side. And that's sort of where the industry is kind of like trying to find its way, and how do we disaggregate so we allow some more commercial activities than we do now. And so I was involved in a lot of those policy discussions to open up the space station, and what NanoRacks is doing and other companies are doing, like Made in Space. And these are great guys, great companies. Is fantastic and revolutionary. And I wish they would get more press and more play, because it's not just always about the launch vehicles, but about what we're actually doing. And that's what anchors everything and allows us to take advantage of all the benefits of these technologies.
Absolutely. So what it seems like is that sort of LEO economy, as you called it, it's currently very dependent on government funding, funding missions to ISS, funding missions that NASA is doing, the ESA is doing, so on and so forth. But it seems like it seems like that other corporations, other companies will really start diving into it more and more once they see at least one example of a company, could be SpaceX, could be Virgin Galactic, starting to make billions of dollars off of private funding,
or trillions if you're Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
So private use of space of space infrastructure and platforms from those companies. So how do you go about, I don't know, incentivizing those companies, making an easier an easier path for those companies to innovate in a way that contributes to private funding?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. The problem is that the legal structure currently is a bit complicated and in some sense still a bit vague. But functionally, at least in terms of LEO, so to speak, developing a LEO economy, that is dependent upon decisions regarding the retirement of the International Space Station. And those are big discussions. I know the House and the Senate recently held hearings on its future.
We're still looking at 2024, I believe, for that.
25 in the president's budget request.
Yeah.
25, right? Okay.
But technologically, like 2028, 2030 is not about money. It's about whether or not the technology is going to hold up. And a lot of the stuff that you need to function is embedded inside these modules that you can't get to. And there's things that you can't bring up again because the shuttle doesn't exist, like solar panels. Now, NASA certainly has lots of margins on these things, but those margins are going to start to be eaten up as we get closer to 2030. And that's why I think it's really important for us to start thinking about the next step. And this is where I think everything's sort of going. I mean, there's a lot of things that is not bubbling up to the public right now. You have a lot of venture capitalists, governments, sovereign wealth funds, and other folks figuring out how to develop this level of economy and how to transition. One big particular problem right now with the economics of LEO, especially as it pertains to the space station, is the barter agreements, the barter clause. So basically, it's no exchange of funds between countries who participate in the space station. That was done on purpose so that things could move more efficiently and they could build up more quickly. But as you develop commercial capabilities on the space station and in LEO more broadly, this becomes a bit of a barrier. And on one hand, you've had problems where NASA has misappropriated resources in contravention of the agreement. For example, giving space on a telescope somewhere else rather than to the space station. And the NASA IGs, has said that this is the line, but it's still not clear where the line is because you have a secondary problem, which is, well, anything you bring up to the space station has to get processed and cleared. And one thing the government doesn't want, it doesn't want anything immoral or anything that'll get anyone in trouble to get up there, even though people try from time to time. But that's the difficult thing, parsing through these policies and these legal prohibitions, because it's very complicated. And these agreements have been fine-tuned over decades. I mean, you look at nanoracks, for example, has found a nice little niche on the space station, and as part of the NASA allocation. And then you have CASIS, which also helps process science experiments and things like that. But really, I've always looked at it from this perspective. We need to incentivize an economy that starts with someone who's sitting in their garage or their basement or their office, and they have an idea, and then they test that idea. And so usually they need, just a little bit of money. So I think it'd be great if we brought back like grants and prizes at the federal level to incentivize some of these economics, because there's certainly lots of other issues when it comes to space exploration technologically that we still have to deal with, in particular like closed loop flight support systems, trying to get higher recyclability rates, dealing with the radiation effects, the microgravity effects on the human body. I don't know if you guys read the Kelly report, but some of that was quite fascinating, even though it was misreported in the media.
Right.
But there were really
As
fascinating
happens in
things
space.
about, yeah, there's really fascinating things that we don't think about because a lot of people want to advocate and democratize space, but we have to do it in such a way that makes sense. And I am not I'm not one of those people that think we should just send everyone on a one-train trip to die. I think, we should be building out the infrastructure so that we get through the solar system in a way that is functional for everybody. And I think space, is open for everybody. And I think, not only American companies, but European companies and others have a lot to offer because there's a lot to do in space. And that's where, the problems with government budgets come in and can sort of constrain from time to time certain programs. And, you hear people always talk about canceling Hubble, which would be at least a bad idea in the near term. It still has a lot of utility, but then going to the next thing, and the next thing requires us to build these satellites that cost a lot. And, were conceptualized 10, 15 years ago. And now we're at a place where everything is being miniaturized and everything's becoming plug and play. So I think we're in a transitory phase in terms of developing that economy. But I think that there are certain targeted areas, especially on the life support side, especially on sensors and things like that, where we could incentivize more economic activity and also science experiments as well. But that has to be balanced with some of these limitations that are set in law. And at the current rate, I don't know what's going to happen with the International Space Station. It's really unclear. There's a lot of ideas, but it sounds like right now Senator Cruz and Senator Nelson want to extend it at least to 25, maybe to 30. So what opportunities is that going to invite, and what problems will that invite? And that's something that the Congress has to deal with and get, some more information on as we move forward. Because, everyone comes in with the greatest idea, but seeing a company succeed, like someone like Made in Space, where they have some capital and they've been slowly integrating, going from plastics to metal to do 3D printing is going to revolutionize, I think, manufacturing. So I think we're still kind of on the upward curve of development, but there are things that I think the government certainly can do to incentivize more economic development.
So to kind of go back to what you were talking about with the prizes, is like the X Prize model what you're thinking about there, or sort of making that a national program?
Something akin to that. With the X Prize, they got out in front of the issue, 18 years ago or so. And it's great. I mean, bringing spotlight to these issues and arguing why it's important. But, with that, I think, there is, the deadline, setting those deadlines are hard. And so as you see with the Google Lunar X Prize not actually getting a winner, but then you see Moon Express and Astrobotic go off on their own and still succeed with private funding is actually a good thing, despite whatever happens with those prizes. So having gold set prizes, I think, are important, or having a pool of potential companies bid for something very unique. That's kind of where the balance is, because sometimes when not sometimes, but when you build up for space activities, I mean, you're dealing with so many different types of export control rules, plus different technologies, many technologies that still haven't been proven out. I mean, we still haven't even tested any of the ideas for mining equipment. I mean, we've done analog tests with the regolith, but there are more issues that we're not gonna encounter until we're actually there. So there's only so much those analogs will do for us in terms of preparation. But I think setting up, that's why I like that idea of maybe like a lunar village or something. That's something that'll be like almost like a free trade zone where everyone can start to build up together, rather than something that's just sort of independent and all over the place, a hodgepodge. And that's actually another thing that I actually worked on when I was at Bigelow, is pointing out that to policymakers, at the very least, that you can't legislate physics. And there's two problems to further development of planetary bodies, at least like the Moon or Mars, which is we want to create a safe environment. What's the point of sending a bunch of people there if they're just going to run into each other and cause damage or harm to astronauts? And so you have to look at the physics. And when I was at Bigelow, I worked with the FAA, and one of those lead statisticians at the time, we literally just got out a piece of paper. I think I actually pulled out an envelope, and we were doing the back of the envelope numbers on, well, what happened if the Apollo 11 LEM had blown up? Like, how far would that debris have spread? And when we did just some of the basic math on that, I mean, we were looking at potentially, depending on how much energy you had, the size of Taiwan in terms of square footage, or square kilometers, rather. I mean, that's a big space to control. And everyone sort of looks at me blankly. Well, how is that not in violation of the Outer Space Treaty if you don't allow for if you allow for that level of sort of containment? People were saying, well, that's just too big of an area. And I said, well, I can't help that unless you want to add some more mass to the moon. But, there's no pressure. There's no overpressure effects. I mean, these are things that we have to start thinking about as policymakers because they impact policy decisions. And, we were just using the FAA spaceport regs. So, if like a rocket blows up on a launch pad and we just change the gravitational constant, and it was given these big ranges. So that's why I think, coordination, and that's why I'm very interested to see how this discussion about space traffic management unfolds, because that's the next step. If we're going to build up an economy, we need that level of coordination, not only nationally, but internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just about to bring up the point from an international standpoint. I mean, we've had we've had a couple of issues recently with the Chinese and satellites both falling to Earth as well as spreading debris out in space,
like the 2007 ASAT test.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So it seems like we're starting to at least have that discussion internationally about, about planning going forward. And you're right. It's not like we can't do the physics for this. We just need to come up with some way of incorporating that physics into the legislation that we're promoting, as well as policy going forward for individual companies, as well as the bigger government organizations conducting those space operations. That's a great point to bring up. I don't see a number of people talking about sort of those effects of sharing space.
Yeah, and that's an interesting topic that we brought up in our most recent episode, talking about humans to Mars.
Yeah, I think there is a clear fix. But for some reason, some folks just don't like the idea. But you can deal with a lot of these problems just by beefing up the registration convention requirements. Because at the end of the day, I just need to know where you are. But here's the thing: you have to dissuade yourself of your terrestrial senses. Mm-hmm. There's only about 500 people on this planet that even understand what it feels like to travel at 18,000 miles an hour around the planet. I mean, that's a unique attribute to have, and gives you, a perspective that you should be translating to policymakers, because this is the thing. What's the goal here? Is the goal to dominate space or to explore space? What are your goals here? NASA's goal is to explore, and we have people that want to explore and utilize those resources. And I think those. Mm-hmm. Those goals, I think, are worthy of a great nation. And if we don't do it, let me tell you, there are plenty of other countries that will do it, in particular China. And, are we going to be in a position, we're already in a race. Like, there's no reason not to call it a race. We just aren't giving it political impetus, giving it, its own sort of podium to dictate from. But part of my sense of how things are going is we are looking forward to developing that economy. Mm-hmm. A lot of partners, not only within Europe, but within Africa and South America and in Central America. Everybody is interested in space. Everybody wants to be part of space. If it's not only either develop their industrial base to educate their population, you look at what UAE is doing. I mean, it's fantastic. Everyone is now pivoting towards space, and this is like not even a major storyline. People are spending lots and lots of money, and soon, my children, my grandchildren will likely be in and living in space. And what they'll be doing, it's not entirely clear yet. But certainly science at the very least, and certainly engineering, because we're going to have to build out all the infrastructure. I mean, how cool would it be to look up when I'm 90 years old, if I can live that long, and see like a dry dock, building the first USS Enterprise? That would be awesome. I mean, that would be
amazing.
Yeah.
Those are goals that are achievable.
You know what would be a good sort of staging ground for this, and I think it's becoming sort of the initial platform for what we're talking about here, is the use of CubeSats, actually, because we have such easy access to them now. It's individual corporations, small companies have such easy access to building their own CubeSat and then taking a ride up on something like a SpaceX Falcon rocket as it's carrying a million other things up into low Earth orbit. Or, in some cases, launching their own. These companies are now having to deal with some of the things that you're talking about, deorbiting practices and what happens, how to craft something that won't split off into a million pieces within space. I remember going to a conference probably about 3 or 4 years ago where the folks at JSPOC were complaining that they were now receiving, tons and tons of phone calls from folks asking about situational awareness, people who are crafting CubeSats, asking about, specific parameters of the CubeSats that they were creating and things like that. So it seems like it's at least starting, but there's still no good framework in place for educating the masses on something like that.
But, it's funny you bring it up, because when I was at the State Department, I dealt and had meetings with some of those folks that were, about 8 years ago, putting together these programs like at the University of Michigan and other places. And they were just, starting to look at the problem and not even considering, the debris issue or interference issue. They were just trying to get
that's another huge one that we haven't even touched on.
But, that was so. But we talk about all that in space, but there's a second part of the conversation that isn't spoken about enough, which when I was at the State Department, I made a big deal about, which is the back end, that when you download the data, where is it going? And, I had people come in and say, well, we're going to put these ground stations here, here, and here, and here. And I go, are they going to be secure? And he go, what do you mean? I'm like, well, can other people get access to it? Is it encrypted? Is it secure? Like, there are export control rules. Mm-hmm. But, in a lot of people's minds, it was like, well, we'll just throw them on the top of mountains. And that's great if it's a microwave, transmitter trying to beam things back down. But, these are sophisticated operations that you're trying to engage with some of these constellations of CubeSats that people are proposing.
Just ask anyone who runs the NASA Space Network about this.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But this belies another point that no one's talking about, and would only occur to you if you happen to periodically look at the the FCC website, which is everybody's applying for spectrum, and we're going to have a spectrum crunch in the next probably 5 years.
The age of SDR is upon us. Yeah. That's absolutely why.
But you can see, like, all the things that have to enable these technologies, we have to go through this checklist. There's so many things. Space is complicated because it's not just one industry. It's a whole everything. Everything's interconnected. And a lot of the rules developed out of the Cold War. So people were concerned about targeting. Perfect example. I won't say which congressman said it, but when we were going over export control reform with regards to the beam, when I was at Bigelow, there was a member of Congress that was concerned about reducing its classification off of ITAR because they thought that you could target like the White House and the Congress if somehow someone hijacked the beam. Well, no matter how many times Mike and I would point out that there's no integrated propulsion. Like, it cannot be, if you dump it, it's just going to burn up. It didn't matter. And, this is part of the problem we have with Congress is that, they have policy choices that make no physical sense. And when that happens, to me, that's just absurd. That's bad policy making. And when things go wrong, and you're using these bad policies, Like, you're opening not only the U.S. government to liability, but the company that is risking its capital and risking its reputation. And in this case, I'm also implicating the swarm example here. Of not going through those processes and having those conversations with government and also with the Congress. People try to go and, think, well, I'm just going to go and ask my congressman for X amount of dollars. And sometimes it can be just as beneficial not to talk about money, but to talk about the implications of the policy.
It's like people are too busy deal making and not busy enough actually getting their information straight. So so this is actually a good question for someone who's running for Congress, or at least a primary candidate for Congress. Then what is your approach to staying informed in terms of legislation and creating policy that makes sense?
Yeah, first and foremost, there's a basic rule that I've tried to live by. You're only as good as your staff. And when you have good staff around you and you have good people that are knowledgeable, it makes you better. For me, I've been around a lot. I've got a lot of degrees. I think I'm one away from tying Mike Griffin. But for me, I've been a part of the community for over 12 years. And, many of the people in the industry are my friends and colleagues. But separating that out between, good policymaking and good friends and colleagues is the trick. And when it comes to space, I'll do non-space issues in a second. When it comes to space, I'm an expert in this stuff. So it's not like I'm going to get hoodwinked. But it gives me an opportunity as a member to highlight certain issues I think are important to the industry. It also allows me to talk not only to the Democratic conference, but to the Republican conference on how to deal with some of these issues and have those conversations, because the deals get made when members work together, when they talk together. And you see that, it's an interesting combination between Cruz and Nelson in the Senate, but it works. I'd like to see that a bit more in the House, and that's something that I'd want to work bipartisanly within the House Science Committee. But certainly there's certain bright lines. When physics is involved, physics is going to dominate, not a check, not whatever a lobbyist gives me, whatever my physics. And that's how I'm gonna objectivism, I think, is an important point to have as a member of Congress. On non-space issues, it's a traditional find the best people. Make sure that they're informed and make sure that you're informed and engaged. But fundamentally, the committee systems can be a little complicated because they're ranked. And, if you're on a certain ranked committee, you can't be on other committees. And so that's the trick, is if I get on House Science Committee, which would be my first choice, what other committees should I be looking at to create that synergy, right? Because, again, my goal is I want Western Maryland to promote itself as the space state it is. And I don't think Maryland gets enough of that. Maryland has been part of NASA since the beginning. You have contractors here. You have government employees. You have people in the private sector all here. We have Maryland tax dollars go to pay for a spaceport that launches resources to the International Space Station. I think there's more we could do to build that up, because I think that is the future. And when you have that type of community, you can have the conversation of why doesn't Western Maryland have a Silicon Valley yet? I live in Gaithersburg, right near right off the 270 tech corridor, and that's growing. But I want to see that grow more. And when you have these jobs, it incentivizes so much more, and these communities grow and they be part of the 21st century economy. And that's what I want to see for Maryland. That's what I see for Western Maryland. I want it to be part of the 21st century economy, where everyone from Potomac to Oakland and Garrett County has the same access to the resources and opportunities as anyone else.
So how do you see that playing out in the district? So I guess also for the listeners, a little bit about the 6th. It was redrawn in 2010. One might call it gerrymandering. I'd call it gerrymandering.
and it's up. I believe it's up. It's currently the subject of a Supreme Court lawsuit over gerrymandering.
Yeah, that's going to be the fun thing. So it is May 20th. The Supreme Court, within the next month before the primary, will likely issue a decision on the Maryland 6, which is also bundled with the Wisconsin cases. And No, it's clear as day that Maryland is gerrymandered the hell out of the state, and I've certainly have been promoting, any way that we can get back to equal representation. And you look at, I think it's Maryland 3rd, Sarbanes district.
Yep,
literally looks like a flux capacitor. It's just like, how the hell do you live on a river?
And the 8th is no better.
But the district, but just to give context, if you look at the district, I'm running in the largest geographical district. It's insane. But despite its size, I think there's a hidden problem, which I've talked about from time to time, which is our founders of America, of the Constitution, thought that we'd have probably about 1 to 50,000 ratio of representation. So something akin to what New Hampshire has. 1 to 750,000 people? That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
When Congress set quickly.
Yeah, and growing. And when Congress set the cap on the seats for the House at 435, the country was a third of the size it is today. I don't understand why we don't increase representation. I think at some level it also will disincentivize certain special interests from flooding those districts with a lot of money to get that influence, against the interest of the people that live there. That's how you dilute. I know I'm supportive of the Van Hollen and Sarbanes have talked about how you vouchers and public money to incentivize more people to run for office. That's completely great. But that's not going to solve the problem. If you can't run for office, especially for federal office like Congress, I couldn't run for Senate even at with $250 donations from like 1,000 people. That's just not gonna. You're not going to be competitive. You're certainly not going to be competitive against people who are billionaires and multimillionaires who literally want to buy the seat. And that's sort of the problem I'm facing right now in Maryland 6th. Is we're running against someone that was in another district. He spent $13 million of his own money, lost, and now he's already spent $6, $7, $8 million to win a seat in which a district he doesn't even live in. We have just too many people that somehow feel that they can buy their way into politics, and this is something I definitely want to break. We got to get back to what the people want, not what other people want.
Yeah. So as part of that, sort of where I was going and kind of tying in with what you were just talking about is the way that the 6th district looks is it includes all of those Western counties, so Washington, Garrett, but it also includes a big chunk of Montgomery County, which for those who are not aware, and I also work in Montgomery County, it is one of the wealthiest, one of the most liberal counties. I think Democrats outweigh Republicans there 3-1. Yeah. I know specifically where I'm working in Rockville and Gaithersburg, there's basically more people that voted in the last election than there are Republicans at all. Yeah. In the entire district, which is, for running in a Democratic primary, that gives you a lot of people to draw votes from. But how do you see sort of what you're talking about with the influence of these big money interests and these people who are looking to buy a seat just to get into Congress? How does that interplay with what's going on in the dichotomy that's kind of made up in that district of the people in Montgomery County who are very well-to-do and have a different set of concerns, especially when it comes to space, versus the people in the western part of the county, which for all intents and purposes are often forgotten in a Democratic primary and very often in the general as well.
Yeah, I've certainly talked to those people, and especially up in the northern counties in Garrett, Washington, Allegheny, a lot of folks don't think Republicans or Democrats are working for them. They don't think anyone's listening to them. They think the world is passing them by. And a lot of them are a bit resentful about it. In Congress, I'm going to be a leader for everybody. I will go up to those northern counties and talk to folks. I have no problem getting yelled at.
Good.
Consider, the opportunities that those areas possess. If you don't have that, like I said, access to broadband, and you don't have the infrastructure, like the roads, you get these 2-lane highways with crumbling roads and these county roads that how can you possibly grow those communities? And you have a town like Frostburg that has a great state university and has an astronomy program. I think there are themes that we can work on and tie into the jobs of tomorrow and the jobs of today, and tell people, listen, you can live there, you can live how you want, but this is what we need. We need to interconnect Maryland. Maryland has a huge bias with the 95 corridor. Western Maryland is barely interconnected with the rest of the state, let alone the eastern seaboard. Ironically, Western Maryland was the crossroads of America for like 150 years. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to get back to that. And I think there's a lot of different ways we could do that. People talk about lengthening the highways. I think an interesting an idea is, boring technology has gone down so low that Elon created a company and is putting a Hyperloop demonstration at the NOMA stop in DC.
Which would be amazing. If we ever got that would be incredible.
Yeah. So it might take 30 years finally to get the loop to go from DC to like Baltimore or New York or something like that. That's fine. That's not necessarily what I'm interested in. I think it's all great. And I think that adds certain synergies later on. But the fundamental issue is we are creating autonomous vehicles. We are creating interconnected vehicles on the highway. Bore underneath these highways and create a completely separate lane, mesh network it out. I don't care. Allow those trucks and other autonomous vehicles to use the underground roads. So this is essentially what Elon's trying to do in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. It will reduce a tremendous amount of traffic. Absolutely. And then maybe later you can work where you can have a Hyperloop stop that bifurcates in DC, goes up to Cumberland, to State College, to Syracuse to New York to DC. And now you've integrated the entire Eastern Seaboard, and you can move around goods and people and services. You could live in New York and work in DC. I mean, this is the reality that we could bring forth if we only had the vision and the consensus to do
right,
it.
and the government is investing a little bit in this right now. I don't know if you've heard of the DARPA Subterranean Challenge.
Yeah. I don't know much about it, but yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, it was actually something that I studied a little while while I was at DARPA. It seems one of these ideas may have floated around the place, but the focus of it is to develop a whole new suite. Sort of give some seed funding to a whole new suite of technologies for operating in underground environments. So hopefully we're at the nascent stages of actually doing something like this. But you touched on something that I kind of wanted to get back to, and I don't want to eat up too much more of your time because we're almost at an hour here. But with respect to the internet, and this can kind of tie up the conversation back to where we started. How do you feel that Congress can make better use of the internet to foster deliberation in an emerging digital democracy? And to clarify that, the internet seems to be keeping us significantly divided into factions. Some might say that we're, I don't know, in some sort of cold civil war, civil cold war. I don't exactly know what to name it, occurring right now on the web, and particularly in social media. And I don't think the answer is necessarily just getting people off of social media completely. Obviously, social media actually has done a lot. Well, yeah, it won't happen. And social media actually has done a lot of good in terms of things like inclusion and organizing, so on and so forth. But how do we break this sort of cycle of online bickering that has forced Americans deeper and deeper into their political corners, mentally appearing as if we're almost two Americas?
And this, you have to have an answer to this one. This one you can't escape.
Yes, the hardest question last.
No. It's an interesting question because you have to balance speech with the borders you create to protect yourself, right? I mean, you have physical borders and then you have legal borders, and finding that that optimum balance is how I kind of look at that problem. You have the European Union has its internet privacy regulations going in effect, I think, at the end of the month.
Right, and the GPR thing that they're pushing out to every app that's on your cell phone right now.
But really, I think it gets down to the basic question of security, right? Because humans, without technology, give away a lot of information. With how they say things, how their accent is, their mannerisms, how they look. These are things we can't control because we have to be out in the public. And I don't want to disincentivize speech. I think speech is the only way for us really to communicate. There's a secondary problem, and this is I think sort of an extrapolation from where we are today of the bowling alone problem. Before, people would get together face to face, and now there's no longer a social cost when someone says something absurd, right? And if you can imagine, if you could get the people who say those things in real time, those nasty things to each other in person, one of two things happen: either they're both going to walk away angry, or they're both going to be in a fist fight. And I don't think we need to incentivize violence. So to some extent, the internet gives us a release, but it also creates, this more tension. And I think when it comes to individual rights, the question is, what do you want to close off? That's the border. That's what I worry about. And so I think it's dependent upon people to figure out the extent to which they will segregate themselves from others. And as you can imagine, that can be a dangerous thing, but it also could be a way to deconflict. Now, regardless, we already live in two realities, right? We have the reality that we live in every day. We can see our hands, we see things, objects, the physical world. But then there's that background reality that we constantly feel like we have to go back to check our Facebook status and whether or not we got retweeted. And this is the first time, I think, in our species where we've had to deal with this. And we've only been dealing with this for, 30 years. And I still think we have a lot of shaking out to do. And I think Congress should continue to keep an eye on things because its basic role is accountability. Are people doing things that are contrary to individual rights, contrary to the body politic, as you've seen with, this Trump administration? So, but that diligence and having that openness, regardless of whether or not people commit crimes or do things that are just socially reprehensible, as long as you still know they exist, that's, I think, still good for society. Because once they start disappearing and they start bubbling up into the physical reality, that's when you have problems. And, when you take that anger and that angst from the internet and you go and you shoot up a school or you shoot up, a concert venue or things like that, like that's the hard thing to balance, because you can't go and arrest someone. This is like precognition, right? It's like Minority Report kind of stuff. Like, but there are other things that allows us to understand when something might be going in the wrong direction. Like in the case of guns, like having a background check. In the case of, just in speech, like if you defame someone or slander someone or libel someone, regardless of whether or not you said it verbally, you wrote it down, or put it on the internet, it's there, and you're still going to be liable if it's not true. So some things are changing, some things are not changing, and we have to be diligent about where we triage the right instances, where we need to put up those borders. And it's not entirely clear to me, and again, I don't think it's clear to anybody.
I was expecting you to have the answer.
No,
I mean, I don't know about this. It seems like an easy answer to me, right?
No, but you can't tell people that they can't get the information they need to exist.
Right.
And you can't tell people that they can't have relationships with other people. And I think the thing is we're looking at the wrong problem, because at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is the data. Going back to what I said, when you have corporations like Facebook and others that have this material that you freely give out, but expect that level of privacy, that's the fulcrum you want to pinpoint and see which way does it tip. And I think that's the important conversation to have. And I think that's where we're starting to go about privacy data. So, you can't disincentivize people from being themselves, but understanding what borders and limitations we should all collectively observe is, I think, the new trend that we will, I think, approach over the next, year, 10 years, 5 years. So I think that's the way that we're going. I still think we're still figuring out, like in space, we're still figuring things out. I mean, we have godlike powers now. I mean, so what do we do with that? So I find it ironic that, like, these superhero movies are so popular at a time when we almost have the technology to do at least some fraction of what you see.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And then it's not so outlandish that we're able to understand our place in the cosmos and continue sometimes I do think about it, and it's amazing that human beings, this simple creature from our perspective, right, that gets in Facebook arguments, can also send a probe to Mars, or we're currently sending a probe to Mars with Mars Insight. That all this sort of is happening in tandem, and that we're a species that's capable of a greater good, and also one that's capable of some pretty bad things.
Yeah, I always remind people that as we were, launching rockets and people to the moon, we were also dealing with the civil rights era, right? I mean, we
and Vietnam.
Yeah, we deal with human issues while beginning to wield the power of gods, right? And as you said, and it'll be interesting to see where humanity takes this going forward.
Yeah, and I tell young people, you now live in a reality where a man launched his car into space. So if you don't think there are opportunities for you, you're not looking hard enough. And being a part of either the space community or science, or even policy and law that underlie all these things, being a part of the community and within the aerospace industry, but not only the broader community, the political community we live in. We are self-governing people, and we have to keep that in mind as we expand out. Otherwise, I guess the expanse storylines will somehow play themselves out. But
save the expanse.
Yes.
Throw that little plug in there.
Right, yeah. I think you just won your primary.
So yeah, I think the future is bright. I think we are dealing, like we've dealt with ever since we've had a printing press, the same problems. People want to control information and data, and they don't want you to have it. Yep. And other people want to have it to the exclusion of others for their own gain. And that's where we should keep our focus. I've had people express their anxieties about robots taking their job. Mm-hmm. Like this is a real phenomenon. And, I say to them, look, there are just some jobs that humans will always do. And there's some jobs that eventually robots to do. But if I were a betting man, I would say that robots will eventually take those repetitive tasks that you don't want humans doing. You really don't. Yeah. But there are other things that have to support that robot. Those where the new jobs are. That's why you may think you're going to lose your job to the robot, but being prepared to be able to repair that technology, to reprogram it, to do these things, this is the way all technology is going. This is just a generalization of the same processes that have played out over and over and over in human history. And we just have to not be so anxious about it and adapt to it in a way that makes sense and doesn't just benefit a few, but benefits as many people as possible.
And I think that's where a lot of that anxiety is coming from, is that, you're running to represent a district that embodies the haves in the southern part of the district, who seem to be those, the coastal elites, as they call them, moving forward, and progressive isn't a 4-letter word there, but you go 45 minutes up to 70 and it's a completely different story up there. Right.
Yeah.
And I guess sort of to tie everything back together. So what is the, if you were to enter what will it be? The 116th Congress, whatever it's going to be. What would be the one piece of legislation that you would want to champion? Say you're on the science committee and everything is good to go on January 3rd. What's the first thing?
I think the first thing is infrastructure.
It is infrastructure week.
Yeah, we have to invest. We have to invest in our country again, and we have to understand that these investments benefit everybody in the long term. I know people talk about costs and things like that, but America is crumbling. And for the folks that live in these affluent areas, they don't see it because it's someone can just snap a finger and somehow gets a road crew out to fix the pothole. But in other areas, they don't have that level of support. And my whole goal is I want to integrate all of Western Maryland. I want you to be able to live in Garrett County and commute down to DC and do whatever you want. Hell, I mean, I don't care if you want to go up to Pittsburgh. I don't understand how there's like once a day up and down and one Amtrak train that goes from DC to Pittsburgh that goes through part of the district. But if you had things that could be connecting Morgantown, West Virginia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philly, Baltimore on a east-west route or a north-south route on the western side of the state, I mean, you're changing the economics for millions of people. You're incentivizing growth all over the place. You're incentivizing businesses to come here. I mean, we're going to desperately need it if Amazon ends up moving their headquarters here. And from what I can tell, Seattle doesn't seem to be doing a very good job of trying to keep them. So if Amazon comes here, we're dropping 50,000 employees plus their families. So we're talking about another 150,000 people in an area that can't even hold the current population. That's a huge problem. But that's also a huge opportunity because with that, more money comes into the economy, more businesses are grown, more jobs are created, and you put that support jobs on top of the growing tech jobs, and you have the next Silicon Valley of the East Coast. That's what I believe, and I think that's why we need that infrastructure spending, and we need to have that vision of connecting all of Maryland for everybody.
Well, because it's also not just about the tax incentives that you give someone like Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, who doesn't need tax incentives. It's investing in those public goods. And And so this headquarters too, I know it's a big deal in Montgomery County politics right now, mainly because of the top 20 cities or regions that are in the bidding for HQ2 to move here. 19 now that I think there was some city in Texas dropped out, Irving, Texas, I think it was. Yeah. That of those 19, 3 of them are in the DC metropolitan area, one, DC, Northern Virginia, and Montgomery County. Outside, I mean, that's a 3 in 19 chance, I guess, is what we have of that coming to our region, and how that's going to just change the economics. It's certainly going to put a strain on whatever local economy it does end up going to. But there is, like you're saying, this potential there with this next level of jobs that's sort of going to bring in a new part of that new economy and maybe alleviate some of that economic anxiety that I've certainly been hearing it. You're hearing it. I think it's the idea that people's jobs are going to be lost to robots is part of that science fiction fear that people have sometimes, but it's our culture doesn't do a great job of painting robots as benign. But
Ultron. But part of that also is making sure that Western Marylanders have the resources to participate in the economy. And again, it's one thing if it's public transportation. It's another thing if it's technology in schools, technology training, retraining for vocational jobs. And we can talk about space and all that, but people still need a plumber. They still need an electrician. And getting people into those jobs is somehow proving difficult. I mean, the average age of a master electrician and plumber is like in the upper 50s, lower 60-year-old range. And those people are near retirement. So, I'm looking at it as someone, I'm 38 years old, and, my wife and I are starting a family and going to buy a house soon. Where am I going to find these plumbers and electricians? And if they don't grow, if that field doesn't grow, then you can certainly expect prices to spike because demand will be so high. And, when you need an emergency, usually what happens when you have a plumbing emergency, you need someone to come right now, not tomorrow. But you need to replenish this economic pool. So that's why, I really think as part of the infrastructure plan is also reinvesting in our schools as well. It's sad to hear what happened over the winter in Baltimore City schools with kids having to sit in classrooms in sub-freezing weather. Like that should never happen. That's absurd.
Absolutely.
But growing those opportunities through infrastructure and through investing in people, I think is the forward. It's the goal. It's the forward-looking policy areas that I want to champion in Congress, because no one should be left behind.
Well, thank you, Chris, for a riveting conversation. I'm certainly going to be thinking about this. We're 37 days out from the primary.
At the time of this recording.
Probably by the time this comes out, it'll be within a month. Not to give anybody on this call heart palpitations or anything. But so I guess the last thing is, Chris, how can our listeners get in touch with you? How can they get involved? How can they support the campaign? Do you have a website, social media, all that? Yep.
Got all that. Got a website. It is hearseyforcongress.com, HEARSEY for Congress.com. I have a Twitter, which is HEARSEY, the number 4, letters MD and the number 6. So Hearsey 4 MD6. And on Facebook, it's Hearsey for Congress. And I'm also on Instagram as well. Awesome. So you certainly put in my name, you can find it. So we're everywhere. We're looking for volunteers. So if you're interested in volunteering in my campaign, please go to the website, fill out the volunteer form. And I wouldn't be a good politician if I didn't ask for not only everyone who lives in Western Maryland's vote, but also if anyone wants to support financially. That's the lifeblood of a campaign, and I'm running a grassroots campaign. So every dollar counts, whether it's a $5 contribution or a $2,700 max out. So I appreciate all the help, and I'm trying to promote the aerospace industry and build up Western Maryland to be, great again.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
well,
we're gonna leave it there.
Well, yeah. So that's great. Any last thoughts, Newton? Any final questions?
No final questions. Thank you very much, Chris, for joining us once again. It's great to hear a voice for science within Congress.
Yeah, and I'm happy to come back if either after the election, talk about other things. We haven't even talked about space law, and that's pretty much my expertise. But happy to do it. So thank you, Newton. Thank you, Jack. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to your audience, and happy to do it again.
Wonderful. And actually, I do have one final question. Besides planet Earth, what is your favorite planet? And Pluto doesn't count.
Planet? Huh. No, see, if you had said a star, I would have had a better answer. But why don't I be a politician and answer the question I want to answer?
Yeah, let's do it.
My favorite star is actually the Canary Star, because when I was, which I think it's Bernard Star might be the formal name. I can't remember. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure one of your listeners will correct me. But
someone guaranteed will.
No. When I was 17 years old, I was the secretary of the local astronomy club, and we would rent out the Mount Wilson telescope. And I got to use the 60-inch telescope that Hubble used to measure the redshifting of galaxies. And, everybody wanted to look at, the very popular aspects, but I wanted to see the Canary Star because it was bright yellow. And knowing that it was a powerful enough telescope to see color, it was the most fascinating to see this bright yellow, canary yellow dot in this blackness was the most fantastic thing for me, because my experience up to that point was some binoculars where I'd look at the fuzzy Andromeda galaxy when it was a little greenish. But to see something in color, to know that it exists, is I think it was a powerful moment in my life to really stick and pursue science.
Awesome.
Wow.
Well, that is a great note to leave it on. Again, thank you, Chris. Everyone go to hearseyforcongress.com. Help out in any way that you can. If anything, any campaign updates between now and the posting of this episode, we will link down in the show notes. All the links to everything that we talked about will also be down in the show notes. So thank you again, Chris and Newton. I guess that's our usual sign-off time.
Yeah, that's our sign-off time. There's one quick thing that I want to share with you guys before we get out of here. The planetary Planetary Society and Intel came together to create the Intel AI Interplanetary Challenge. They created a series of 6 videos featuring Bill Nye, Robert Picardo, and special guests to showcase how AI could be used to further space exploration. To enter for a chance to win prizes such as an MSI laptop, head over to aichallenge.intel.com/space. That's aichallenge.intel.com/space. You may even see a familiar face on there in a few weeks. So with that, Jack.
Awesome. I'm glad you finally got the copy for that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so yeah, as always, I'm your host, Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.